In this video I'm going to show you the painting of the secondary armament for the port side of the model. This is similar to what was in the previous video, except that I'm going to be focusing on the painting side of things. I'll be using Tamiya XF24 to paint these parts. I have pre-thinned it with 50% Tamiya acrylic thinner. For my airbrush, it's nothing special, it's just a generic airbrush. It is a gravity-fed dual-action airbrush. The reason why I want a gravity-fed airbrush is because you can paint with literally one drop of paint. So if you're going to be painting little small pieces one at a time, like I did with the previous video for the superstructure parts, you can take a little drop of paint on a stick like that and put it into the well and paint one part, mask the next one, paint it, mask paint, without having to use a whole lot of paint. So in this sense it can be quite economical to paint. But for this lot there's too many parts to paint, so I will fill it up more later. But I'll get started with this little bit that's in the airbrush at the moment. So my technique is basically all focused on the actual masking. So once I've masked everything, painting is just pretty simple. So just throw the paint on, get nice, clean, even coverage, and then remove the tape. So most important thing to do now is just to hold these things in such a way that you don't mess them up or touch the paint before it's properly dried. So for that I just have these crocodile clips and a board to stick them in. So now it's just a matter of attaching them all in some way. Just have to be careful that the way you attach them doesn't bite into the plastic and then leave a mark. But you can jam them into holes and grab a bit of masking tape and so on. I mean, the grip doesn't have to be so great, it just needs to be able to stand up to a bit of air. For these I haven't glued in the base plates because I still have to put in the guns. I wanted to be able to paint them without the barrels installed, just to make it a little bit easier, but I needed the bases in place such that I could properly position them on the kit. I would stick it there, but it looks like there's a bit of overlap on that end, so I'm just going to try and jam it in the middle. Yeah, it's a pretty good fit. Seems quite sturdy. That should work. I'll do the same for all of these. So the other thing you might have noticed is that I'm focusing on the vertical surfaces for now. I'll come back later and paint the horizontal surfaces properly. For the most part, those are painted in the color of the deck, but for these guns and the top of their mounts, they are painted in camouflage colors. So they're not going to be completely correct from the top, straight out of the box, although it'll be pretty close. But when you look at them straight on from the side, they should look correct. And then I'll just come back and touch up the top a little bit later. So now I've run out of crocodile clips to attach these things to. So for these last two pieces, they don't have base plates. They don't have a good place for me to grab them anyway. What I'll do is I'll just stick them onto a piece of masking tape and then hold the masking tape. Paint's coming out nicely, looks quite even. And now it's just spray, not trying to put on so much that it gets overly wet. Keeping the brush moving so it doesn't pool and start running. Giving it a little bit of a gap between sprays to make sure that it can dry a little bit. Normally when I'm using tape, I'm spraying a whole lot more at one go, and I'd stick them to the lid of a ice cream tub basically, so that's a bit more rigid and easier to handle. But I'll just make do with a loose piece of tape for now. Only for two pieces it's a bit awkward to handle, but it's not so bad. And for this barbette, I suppose, I'll just grip it with lockable tweezers. Very useful to have these for painting and such. Just checking that the masking tape is properly pressed on. I did mask these up the day before. If paint does get under the masking tape, it's not the end of the world. Come back and correct it. Once you have some paint down and you've got the lines in pretty much the right place, it's a lot easier to make adjustments and corrections when you have something to, or a line at least, to follow. It's just a lot of patience here, coming backwards and forwards and trying to get it right. That seems fine. Just leave it there. And now I'll just slowly go through all of these. Same thing. Just press down on the tape to make sure it's stuck nicely, or at least as best as possible, and then just spray on the paint to get good coverage. All the skill was in placing the tape, and you have lots of opportunities to correct the placement of the tape before you start spraying. I don't know how other people do this, but for me this is what I consider to be effective. I think it looks quite good, the end result, and it's also not too difficult. Procedure to follow in the place of skill. So for those who don't know, a dual action airbrush simply means that you press down on the trigger and the air starts flowing. And then as you pull back on the trigger, it pulls back a needle, and that allows paint to start flowing. And that allows you to control the amount of paint flowing through it, which is quite nice. compared to a single action airbrush whereby you press down upon the needle and air and paint starts flowing at the same time. This allows far more control, makes things a bit easier. Tools are so important when building things, so a good tool that's going to do the job correctly is always worth it. As for things like siphon fed airbrushes, I suppose you could use those for bigger jobs, but even for painting the hull of a ship, you can fill up that well with quite a lot of paint. It's never really felt like an impediment using a smaller well on top like that that's gravity fed, and then you get all the advantages of being able to paint with very small amounts of paint, whereas with a siphon fed airbrush you would need to suck the paint up the siphon first. I also think it's a bit nicer having the well on the top of the airbrush. It means you can get it closer to the model without it bumping into things. I think I'm starting to run out of paint now. Yeah, there's no more paint in there. So I'm just gonna fill it up now. I'm not gonna use the stick, I'm just gonna pour a lot of paint in. I'm not so concerned about this paint because it's unmixed. It's just this color straight off the shelf. The trick for pouring paint from a jar into the airbrush is to use a stick. Let the stick direct the paint down into the airbrush. Now that there's a more substantial amount of paint in it, I'll put the lid on so that I don't accidentally slosh it out, or I know that I'm becoming too vigorous with my movements if the lid falls off. Let's check this one more time, make sure that I got everything. This one just has one tiny little triangle to paint. And this is a bit of a touch-up, so when I had been doing the last little bit of superstructure, the original line that I painted onto this one wasn't quite right, so I just need to move it a little bit higher at the bottom end of this piece. That should do it. So that's the end of the painting. Next is to just wait for these parts to dry off a bit, and then to do the best part, which is removing the tape and hopefully seeing good clean lines that line up correctly with everything else that's been painted so far. So the parts have dried off a little bit now. The paint is dry enough to be handled, so now I can just remove the tape. Coverage looks good, color looks good, but no masking, so it's hard to mess those up. These little needle-nosed curved tweezers are my go-to tweezers. For whatever reason, I find them to be very useful in so many applications. It's just easy to pick the corner of the tape and remove it. Then you can see I used the 1mm tape to place the original line, and then the wider tape just to fill in coverage. It's easier to control the thin 1mm tape. That looks pretty good. Nothing special about that piece. Let's take a look at this little triangle. Looks about right. These turrets have quite a curvy shape, so it's going to be difficult to get good lines on them. I will prioritize the lines from the side view and compromise a little bit on the top lines. I think it's more important that it looks good side on than it does top down. Removing the masking tape is one of the most satisfying parts for me when building a model. I especially like it on the hull when there's very complicated camo and you remove layer upon layer and this pattern just emerges, and then once you've removed everything it looks correct like the picture. That's always very nice. Sometimes it can be a bit difficult to find a way into this, to removing the masking tape. Put it on too well sometimes. There we go. I had intended for this to be a short video following on from the previous painting and masking of the superstructure video. I didn't think there would be enough video or words to say about this, but it seems I was wrong. I do, however, expect the next video or two to be short videos, basically showing the result of what I've done on the starboard side of the ship. I don't think there's a need to go through the full details of that. It'll be much of the same thing again. Then the next full video will probably be of me painting the deck on these pieces, so essentially finishing off the camo and deck for them. And then I'm thinking the next completed ship video that I'll do will be of the USS Missouri, the third of the models that I built. And that's all the parts unmasked. And now for the moment of truth. How does it look? Parts appear to line up. The markings appear to line up. If we go back a bit, how does it look? Pretty good. I think that's a pretty good job for a first pass. Just some minor touch up to do, but I'm quite happy with that. That's it for this video. Cheers.